It begins with a sound, a single sharp tone that cuts through the hum of machines under Cheyenne Mountain. Every officer inside that fortress knows what it means. It's not a drill, it's not a test. It's the sound of the world possibly ending. On the night of November 9th, 1979, inside the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, that sound echoed. The room was dim, lit by green radar screens and low fluorescent lights. The air tasted of metal and coffee. Dozens of operators, analysts, and watch officers manned consoles that monitored the skies over 2 continents. For months, tension had been climbing. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. NATO had deployed new missiles to Europe. The arms race wasn't slowing down, it was accelerating, and every night the job of these men and women was to watch for the one signal they prayed would never come. That night, it did. A message flashed across a computer screen. Missile launch detected, then another, then dozens more. According to the system, a massive Soviet nuclear strike was inbound toward the United States. The room fell silent. Only the machines spoke. At first, some assumed it was another training scenario. Simulations were common. Operators regularly practiced for nuclear war. But there was something different this time. No one had scheduled a test. No one had announced a drill. Lieutenant General William Odom, the Director of Operations for the National Security Agency, would later describe that moment in dry bureaucratic language, an anomalous input into the NORAD warning system. But for those inside the mountain, it wasn't a line in a report. It was panic barely kept under control. Standard procedure snapped into motion. Missile tracks were confirmed by computers in Colorado Springs, then cross-checked by the Pentagon's National Military Command Center. Within minutes, the data reached Zbigniew Brzezinski, the president's national security advisor. He was woken from his sleep by a call at 3 a.m. "Sir," the voice on the other end said, "we have indications of a large-scale Soviet launch." Brzezinski sat up in bed. He didn't wake his wife. If it was real, there would be no point. He asked for confirmation. "Are you sure?" The answer came. "We're still verifying. It appears to be hundreds of missiles." According to Brzezinski's later account, he prepared to call President Jimmy Carter. He was about to recommend retaliation. Then the second call came. "Sir, it appears to be a false alarm." The entire sequence lasted only minutes. But for those minutes, the world balanced on the edge of annihilation. Inside NORAD, the staff was already racing to understand what had happened. The radar screens hadn't shown anything. No ground-based sensors had picked up incoming warheads, and yet the computer system had displayed a massive, coordinated Soviet strike. After hours of investigation, the truth emerged. A technician had accidentally loaded a training tape into the main computer. The system, designed to simulate an all-out attack for exercises, had injected fake missile data into the live warning network. What was meant for drills had appeared as reality. It was a simple mistake, but one that could have triggered the end of civilization. The military quickly updated its procedures, separating the training network from the live warning systems. But the incident left a scar. It showed just how fragile the nuclear command chain was, and how fast a human or technical error could light the fuse. In public, the government said little. The Cold War demanded confidence. But inside those bunkers, confidence was gone. The operators knew that their systems, built to prevent surprise, had nearly created one. A few months later, in 1980, it happened again. It was just after 2 a.m. on June 3, 1980. NORAD's early warning network lit up with alarms once more. This time, the displays showed something different. 200 Soviet missiles inbound, crossing the Arctic toward the United States. Phones rang. Commanders scrambled. At Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha, nuclear bomber crews raced to their aircraft. Engines started. Pilots climbed aboard, waiting for the final order to launch. The US was within minutes of initiating retaliation, but again, something didn't make sense. Radar didn't show incoming targets. Satellites were quiet. The data appeared and vanished, appeared again, then vanished once more. Ghost missiles. After tense minutes, confirmation arrived. It was another false alarm. A single 46-cent computer chip had malfunctioned, generating random signals that appeared as incoming warheads on radar screens across the system. The chip was replaced, the data normalized. The order to stand down was given. The bombers taxied back to their shelters. One officer interviewed years later said quietly, "It was too close, way too close." These two incidents, the 1979 training tape and the 1980 chip malfunction, would become case studies in how fragile the world's most powerful systems truly were. The command structure had held, but barely. Each event depended on humans who refused to act before they were certain. Among those humans was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who later wrote, "The world may never know how close we came." And perhaps it was better that way. To understand how this could happen, you need to understand what NORAD really was. Deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, the complex was built during the 1960s as the ultimate command bunker, the nerve center of continental defense. Steel blast doors, 3 feet thick, could seal shut in seconds. Each floor floated on massive springs designed to absorb the shock of a nuclear explosion. Inside, computers processed data from radar stations, satellites, and sensors scattered across the northern hemisphere. Its mission was simple but terrifying. Detect a Soviet nuclear strike as early as possible and warn National Command before the missiles hit. The United States had about 25 minutes to respond. That response might mean the destruction of the planet. The system was a triumph of engineering and a monument to paranoia. Because in the Cold War, certainty was a myth. Every signal had to be interpreted, every glitch analyzed, every blip double-checked before lives were decided. The US and the Soviet Union had spent decades locked in a balance of terror, each side convinced the other might strike first. That fear drove investment, invention, and insanity in equal measure. And at the heart of it all sat NORAD, the watcher in the mountain. For the operators inside, the job was mostly routine. Long hours, endless data streams, occasional simulations to test reflexes. But underneath the monotony was constant dread, the knowledge that any day could be the day. So when the alarm sounded in 1979, their reaction wasn't surprise, it was resignation. The war everyone had trained for might finally be starting. The command network worked exactly as designed. In seconds, data was flowing from radar sites in Alaska and Greenland, from early warning satellites in orbit, from naval tracking stations scattered across oceans. The problem was, all of it was fake. A single mistake, a tape loaded into the wrong computer, had faked Armageddon. General William Odom later called it a training error of extraordinary consequence. He wasn't exaggerating. Had 1 or 2 more confirmations aligned, the president could have authorized a retaliatory alert. Bombers could have taken off fully armed. Missiles could have been unlocked. And once that chain began, there was no guarantee it could be stopped. In nuclear war planning, timing is everything. Hesitation means death, overreaction means extinction. That's why the real heroes of those nights weren't the systems, but the people who doubted them. Colonel William Souter, one of the watch commanders at Strategic Air Command during the 1980 incident, later told reporters, "The radar didn't match the computers. When that happens, you don't move. You breathe, you check, you think." His pause saved lives. Inside the Pentagon, procedures were rewritten again. Backup verification systems were added. Training networks were air-gapped from live feeds. And every operator was drilled on one new rule: don't believe it until the radar agrees. But the scars of those nights ran deeper than technical fixes. They exposed something terrifying: the thin line between defense and disaster, Between a mistake and a war, by 1983, the world had grown even more dangerous. President Ronald Reagan had taken office. Tensions with Moscow were at their highest since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The US had announced its strategic defense initiative, Star Wars, as the press called it, and NATO was running massive war games in Europe under the codename Able Archer, exercises that simulated a full-scale nuclear exchange. The Soviets were on edge, convinced the exercises might be cover for a real attack. In that climate of paranoia, a single error could ignite everything. On September 26, 1983, that error nearly came. At a secret Soviet early warning base south of Moscow, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat at his console. His job was the same as his American counterparts: detect launches, report them immediately, and let higher command decide what came next. Just after midnight, the alarms blared. The system reported that a missile had been launched from the United States. Then 4 more, 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles heading towards the Soviet Union. The screens glowed red. Klaxons screamed. The computers said this was not a drill. Petrov's orders were clear: notify the General Staff, confirm an American strike, and prepare for retaliation. But something didn't fit. 5 missiles. If America were launching a real first strike, it wouldn't send 5, it would send thousands. Petrov hesitated. He waited. He checked the radar. No confirmations. Only the satellite warning system insisted the attack was real. He made a decision. He told his superiors it was a false alarm. Minutes ticked by. No explosions came. He had been right. The satellites had misinterpreted the reflection of sunlight on high-altitude clouds as missile launches. Petrov's calm judgment had saved the world from nuclear war. Later, he was quietly reprimanded for not following procedure and quietly thanked off the record. He faded into obscurity, living out his life in a small apartment, rarely speaking of that night. When he finally told his story decades later, he said simply, "I was just doing my job." When Stanislav Petrov made his decision that night in 1983, he had no way of knowing that his American counterparts had faced the same nightmare only a few years earlier. The two superpowers, locked in suspicion and fear, were both learning the same lesson: that their machines were faster than their minds, and that survival depended on hesitation. After the 1979 and 1980 NORAD false alarms, the US quietly began overhauling its entire warning infrastructure. Engineers installed new fail-safes, replacing aging hardware. Computers were upgraded to isolate simulation data from live systems. The command chain added redundant verification steps before any presidential alert could be issued. But even with better machines, the human element remained the same: a handful of men and women whose judgment was the only barrier between a false signal and global catastrophe. Zbigniew Brzezinski would later describe those moments on the phone in 1979 as the loneliest minutes of my life. He recalled how he waited, expecting confirmation that a nuclear exchange had begun. He never woke his wife. There was no point, he said. If the attack was real, we would all be dead within half an hour. When the second call came, the one that said it was a false alarm, he simply sat in silence. No relief, just the awareness that the system he trusted had failed him once. He knew it could fail again. Inside NORAD, younger officers began referring to those events as ghost strikes. It became a quiet superstition, a reminder that every bright green blip on a radar screen could be a lie. In Washington, Congress demanded answers. The Pentagon issued a report describing both incidents as isolated technical anomalies. Privately, generals knew it was more than that. They had built the most complex defense network in history, and it had been fooled by a training tape and a broken chip. General William Odom, who would later head the National Security Agency, called it a warning from the system itself. He meant that the machines had proven a truth their designers didn't want to admit. No network that big, that fast, and that complex could ever be perfect. Perfection was a myth. Fallibility was the rule. Across the ocean, Soviet commanders were learning the same thing. Their satellites and computers were prone to the same errors: cosmic rays, reflections, bad wiring, or human fatigue. And yet both sides continued to trust the technology that could destroy them. The irony of the Cold War was that the more precise the weapons became, the more fragile peace was. Every upgrade shortened the fuse. Every innovation narrowed the margin for error. By the early 1980s, the United States had developed launch-on-warning capability, a policy that allowed retaliation before enemy missiles even landed. That meant that a false alarm wasn't just an inconvenience. It could start a nuclear exchange within minutes. In that environment, restraint became the highest virtue. The ability to doubt what the screen said became an act of heroism. When Stanislav Petrov refused to report an American strike, he violated protocol and saved civilization. When Colonel Suter paused instead of launching bombers, he did the same. When Brzezinski waited for confirmation before waking the president, he joined them in the same unspoken brotherhood of hesitation. Historians would later call them the men who waited. They were soldiers, analysts, technicians, but also guardians of reason in an age of fear. After 1983, both superpowers began quietly reconsidering how close they had come to mutual destruction. Diplomatic backchannels reopened, arms control treaties regained traction. Even Reagan, once a hardliner, began to see the danger of living permanently on the edge. In 1984, he signed National Security Decision Directive 119, ordering a full review of U.S. early warning procedures. It required verification from at least 2 independent data sources before any nuclear alert could reach the president. The order was meant to prevent exactly what had almost happened, a false alarm turning into a real war. But the reforms didn't erase the fear. Every operator who had lived through those alarms carried it with them. Many stayed silent for decades, bound by classification and guilt. Some retired early, unable to shake the memory of those minutes when the world almost burned. Colonel William Odom later said, "The system did not malfunction. It behaved as designed. The malfunction was in our belief that it could not. It was a rare admission that technology was not the enemy or the savior, but simply a mirror of the people who built it." The NORAD false alarms became mandatory study material for new officers in the nuclear chain. In classrooms buried under mountains, instructors repeated the same lesson again and again. Data is never truth. Data is evidence. Truth requires judgment. That sentence, more than any weapon, became the real defense of civilization. By the mid-1980s, the Cold War had entered its final decade, but the threat remained. Missiles stayed on alert. Bombers flew constant patrols. Satellites scanned the skies every second of every day. The machine of deterrence never slept. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, the men inside Cheyenne Mountain kept watching their screens as they always had. History was changing outside, but inside, the rhythm of vigilance stayed the same, because even peace could vanish with one false blip. To this day, NORAD continues to operate beneath Cheyenne Mountain. Newer computers, faster networks, the same concrete walls. But every new generation of officers learns about those nights in 1979 and 1980. They learn about the burned-out chip, the training tape, and the ghost missiles. And they learn about the pause, the quiet human act that saved everything. Looking back, historians call the late 1970s and early 1980s the most dangerous period of the nuclear age. Not because leaders were reckless, but because systems had grown too complex to control. A single human decision made in seconds could erase continents, and twice, maybe 3 times, humanity survived because someone refused to believe what the computer told them. When asked years later if he ever feared those moments would return, Zbigniew Brzezinski said, "Technology evolves, fear doesn't. The next crisis will look different, but it will feel the same." He wasn't wrong. Every generation since has built faster systems, hypersonic missiles, AI-driven detection networks, real-time command interfaces. But the lesson of those Cold War nights remains unchanged. No algorithm can replace human doubt. Stanislav Petrov died in 2017, largely forgotten by the world he saved. In his small apartment, he kept the same old radio he'd used to listen to Western music in the 1980s. When asked if he ever thought about that night, he said, "No, not often. I just did what any sane person would do." But sanity in that moment was a rare thing. In America, the men who stood watch under Cheyenne Mountain mostly faded into quiet retirement. They rarely spoke of their shifts, their decisions, or their fears, but they passed on one quiet tradition. Before ending every watch, they would turn to the next crew and say the same 3 words. Stand by. Wait. It wasn't procedure. It was wisdom. Because the next time might not be an accident. The next warning might be real, but the next decision would still belong to a human being staring at a screen, listening to that same sharp tone echo through the room. There's a photograph from 1980, black and white, grainy, slightly blurred. It shows a young airman sitting at a console, headset on, staring into the glow of a radar display. He looks calm, but if you look closer, you can see his hand gripping the edge of the desk so tightly that his knuckles are white. That photograph captures the essence of the Cold War better than any missile parade or political speech. It shows a person trying to stay steady while the world around him might collapse. That's the real story of the night America thought the missiles were real. Not the machines, not the malfunctions, but the minds that refused to give in to panic. When historians teach the Cold War, they focus on diplomacy, arms races, and ideology. But the secret truth is that history turned not on grand strategy, but on moments of doubt, seconds when a person decided to pause, to question, to breathe. In those seconds, entire civilizations survived, and though decades have passed, the world still lives under the same shadow. The weapons are smaller, the computers smarter, but the system is still human at its core. Somewhere tonight, in a windowless room deep underground, someone is watching a screen, waiting for an alarm that may never come. And if it does, the same choice will appear: act fast or think first. If the lesson of those nights survives, we might be saved again. In the end, the Cold War didn't end because one side won. It ended because both sides learned fear. Real fear, not the political kind, but the kind that makes you understand what's at stake when your machines tell you the sky is falling. For all its arrogance and danger, the nuclear standoff created an unexpected kind of discipline. A discipline of caution, a belief that hesitation can be moral, that slowing down can be an act of courage. That is the legacy of those false alarms. They didn't start a war. They taught humanity how not to. Today, the Cheyenne Mountain complex still hums quietly under the granite of Colorado. Its corridors are lined with cables and history. Newer generations of officers walk past the old consoles that once glowed with false data. Many of them don't realize how close it came, that the floor they stand on once vibrated with the engines of bombers ready to take off. But some do, and those few keep the story alive. They know that in 1979, a training tape nearly ended the world, that in 1980, a broken chip almost did the same, and that in 1983, one man's calm prevented it from happening at all. They know that every screen can lie, that every system can fail, and that the only thing standing between life and extinction is a person who remembers to breathe. So when the next alarm sounds, and someday one will, the hope of the world will rest again on someone's judgment. A young officer, maybe not much older than the ones who sat there decades ago, will have to decide whether the data in front of them is real, whether to pick up the phone, whether to speak the words that no one wants to hear. If that day comes, let them remember the story of the night America thought the missiles were real and the people who proved that thinking is stronger than panic. Because history isn't made by those who react fastest. It's made by those who wait long enough to be certain.